folks, we got a pretty cool old project up here on the lift table today in the garage. This is a Planet Junior Model HT tractor with a Toro MH engine on it. I picked this up back in November. It came up for sale and I ended up grabbing it. I figured it'd be a pretty cool piece to put in my collection. I've been sort of getting into the older walk-behind tractors aside from Gravely's, as much as I appreciate them, and they have been a huge part of my business here in New England, repairing and servicing them. I really kind of been taking a liking to the older 20s to mid to late 50s walk-behinds that were produced back in the day, such as the Planet Juniors, the Speedex, the Bohlins walk-behinds, Simplicity walk-behinds, Springfield, all that stuff. So I've been looking for those and getting together a collection little by little, but I've been happening into Planet Juniors lately, and this is one of them. So we're going to be doing a mechanical revamp on here. Nothing too extensive, but making sure everything is up to snuff and getting it running for the shows this year. So this has a Tillotson carburetor on it, which I was able to find a gasket set for, so I was pretty happy about that. The engine's not seized. Hopefully I don't have to pull the head off of here because I don't have head gaskets, but if I have to, I will, and we'll address that, and we can get some compression out of it. I got a sheet metal shop that I got to approach to see if they can build me an original style muffler for this down the road. I know the gas tank is clean. Handlebars are going to have to get straightened out. As you can see, somebody really racked them pretty good when they were moving this thing around, and the same thing goes for the cultivator as well. So we're going to have to get that all straightened out. And it has the drive clutch underneath this shroud here, so we'll get that freed up, and hopefully that's all set and the lining is okay on it. So we got a little bit of a project on our hands, folks, but let's get to it. So in order to get this aluminum shroud off of here, as you can see, there's a bunch of little screws like 1024s or 832s in the side of it, but unfortunately we have some down behind here, and as you can see, this shroud here also goes over the engine shroud. So what I'm going to do is pull this one off, which it has to come off anyways to address the clutch on this thing. So we're going to see if we can finagle it out of here without pulling the gas tank off, but worst case we will get that bracket off of there. And along with the shroud, they also ran the throttle cable, as you can see, through this curled over lip right here. And it's sort of a tube where it goes through, and then it comes down behind the carburetor to a bracket, and then loops through the governor arm back there. So there's no real easy way to get that off of there. And I was debating whether I should just cut the casing, because I have new casing and new wire that I can put into here, but just to maintain crustaceous nature, I figured I'd try to at least save the outer casing, and I can put a new wire inside of it. So we're going to make an attempt to salvage it, but I have to get this air cleaner and stuff off of here in order to better access the governor arm behind it. So all the shroud bolts are up. I did have to pull off the fuel tank up here because I tried pulling off one of the stacked nuts underneath this bolt right here, if you can see where my finger is, and they were hitting that, so I was able to get it up, but the fuel tank, the way it curves around the back here, it still wasn't able to lift up without hitting that tank. And of course, now that the tank is gone, this should come right off of here. Hopefully that'll stay put. The throttle cable still is attached to it. I couldn't get it to slide out of that peened over piece, as you can see where it runs through that curled over edge. I got it to move, but it's not coming out of there, so I'm gonna have to work on that a little bit more. And I did nip the cable, so I know it's gonna have to get replaced, so I figured I'd just cut it, and that way I can salvage the outside casing. So here's our inner workings of this Planet Junior. They're pretty cut and dry machines, really. It's just chain driven off the engine to this big sprocket. The clutch is in the middle here on this jack shaft, and then you have the wheel drive chains on either side, and those go down to a hub with a ratcheting pawl. So it's a single direction drive system. It'll only drive forward because as you're rolling the wheels forward, it'll click, so that ratchet will freewheel. And then of course when you start to engage it and you put the drive system in, it binds up. That ratchet will catch the teeth on the inside of the hubs and begin to drive the tractor forward. So no reverse or anything like that. But we came here for this shroud, so let's see about getting all these screws out of here, and then we can pull this thing off and see how much mouse stuff is packed into here. I'm not sure how these come apart, so we might have to pull this head shroud off of here first, because I think it goes together like that, and it's keeping this main shroud from coming back off. Oh yeah, I probably wouldn't have made it out because there's a big boss right there. Looks like for the air. And it feels like some of the junk in this shroud is holding it on here. Unless there's another screw in it. Hey, there's another screw in it. Imagine that. One more directly in the bottom. So in order to get this shroud off, aside from the screw that I forgot underneath it, it's also just hitting the frame of this thing, and I'll show you the lip once I get it off of here. So what I did is I loosened up these front engine mount bolts just enough to raise this thing up, and hopefully I can slip the shroud past it, because as you can see, this shroud, it just barely. Oh, of course, now it's going to come out. There we go. Well, there you have it, folks. Yeah, it was pretty well full of stuff. And that was the nest that just fell out of it. It's been in there for a little while now. I'll have to get that all scraped out, cleaned out. Luckily, it didn't rot through any of the aluminum. It's thick enough, this cast aluminum. It did rot through the shroud here on the side for the dirt when the wheel comes around. But everything else looks okay, including the flywheel, which is good. We just got to get all that stuff off of there. So we'll grab the vacuum, get that cleaned up. Alrighty, so a lot of the heavy stuff is all cleaned off the engine, at least enough where we can spin the thing over and get that flywheel pulled. So what I am going to do now is I took the master link out of this drive chain because this clutch is stuck in gear, so it wants to move these wheels. So we're going to get this pulled through here, providing I can get the chain to move well enough to do so. Or if it even has enough clearance to come off of this sprocket. So while I'm spinning this over, I did feel one of the valves just push loose. So it must have had a sticky valve from sitting. Alright, now that our chain is off, we can pull this thing over. So right now that's got no compression. You can hear the piston's moving at least, which is good, but there's no oomph to it. And this right here, it does have a decompression valve on it, which I thought was kind of interesting. And that doesn't seem to make a difference. So that means that most likely we do have a stuck valve. I don't know if I can see inside of this exhaust port or not. You can just barely see the stem in there, whether I'm holding the camera steady enough. It is not moving. So unfortunately we do have a stuck exhaust valve, so that means this head's going to have to get pulled off. And I don't have any head gaskets for these, nor have I researched to see if you can still get them, which there's a chance that you might be able to. But let's see about getting this head pulled off and see how everything looks underneath. Yeah, this goes to show you how long this thing's been sitting for. You can see there's an awful lot of crust on the top of this engine. A lot of white powdery stuff, corrosion from the head itself. As you can see, most likely the exhaust valve was just left open wherever this thing stopped rotating, and with the muffler being rotted off as it is, a lot of moisture got into there. So the intake does still move, which is good. And the sides of the cylinder, as you can see as well, hopefully, they get a little bit of, right there, that surface rust on there. So I get that cleaned off of there really lightly. It's not enough where it's going to keep this thing from running, luckily. It's not pitting or anything like that, so that'll be okay. And the best part is the head gasket is still intact and in good shape. It's a metal head gasket, so as long as I get these mating surfaces cleaned up, this will still work. As much as I like to put a new one in there, it's not something I haven't researched to see if I can still get head gaskets for these Toro engines, but that one will do just fine. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and get this head cleaned up. I kind of did things out of order because what I was going to originally do is pull this flywheel off and make sure we had spark before we get into the engine, because that's more crucial than this stuff is, because you can always make gaskets and stuff like that. But anyways, since we're here, I'm going to get this cleaned up and I'll check back with you guys once everything's all nice and scraped clean. Alright folks, so since we made it this far, I'm just going to pull these valves right out of here, because this exhaust valve, I got it to move, but it's pretty darn stuck, and I'd rather just take it right out and be able to clean the stem up and everything and just do it properly and be able to lap them in instead of trying to just do it halfway. Because I was going to use a piece of tool steel on the face and just open them up, clean them up the best I can, but I just assume lap them. That way I know this thing's got enough compression and everything's seating like it should be. So there's our intake. As you can see, the face of the valve is pretty well rusted up from having all that moisture in there. Now we get the challenge of getting the exhaust valve out and pushing that up through, which I really hate to pry on the head. And this spring is down inside of here. Let's see if I can get something slid in between the stem and the lifter and just keep working my way up. I did work some oil down in here, so it does have some lubrication in there. Obviously this isn't the ideal way to do it because you're putting pressure on the lobe of the camshaft and pushing up on it, which isn't always the best thing to do. But sometimes it is necessary to get a valve out. So I'm going to work this up and down a little bit, just to see if we can get it freed up a bit more. And you got to be really careful doing that with a metal hammer on the head, because you don't want to hit it on either side and bend the head of the valve or just snap it right off. So you got to be really good about hitting it square in the middle the best you can. This thing was pretty darn stuck inside of here. It had a lot of carbon. You can kind of see some of it, the heavy carbon buildup on the side. It's not really thick. It's just very, very hard solidified carbon, and it wedges itself in between the valve stem and the guide and just kind of locks it inside of there. So I had to spin the top of it. I put a flathead inside of a drill and spun this valve like crazy. I hit it with brake cleaner. I hit it with the penetrating oil, and I was able to break up some of this enough where I could pull it all the way out. So now that it's out of here, I can clean up the guide and clean up the stem. You can kind of see the head of this one. Of course, I've been going at it with pliers and whatnot, so you really can't see the face like it was when I first opened it up, but it definitely will not seat well as it is, so that's going to have to get lapped in. And so you guys can see this before I go ahead and clean all these ports up and lap everything in. That is the state of crust in the exhaust port and the intake. It's got a lot of old carbon and stuff built up on it, some surface rust, but both of them have to get cleaned out pretty darn well. And then of course, now that the valves are out, I can finish cleaning up the surface of the head here on the engine. So I wanted to show you guys what I'm doing here. As you can see, this is the intake valve. They're all cleaned up. I'll have pictures before and after that I took on the head here. But to lap these in, because the tops of these were so messed up from all the rust and the corrosion and everything, that the suction cup thing that you use for lapping in valves by hand, one of these deals right here, that it won't stick to the top of these heads just because there isn't a nice smooth surface to create a suction. But they do have these slots in them. So what I've been doing, and it took a little while with the exhaust, but it seemed to work out okay, is I just have a drill here with a flat head in it, and I just put it in there. And what I'm doing down here, you guys can, well, you can kind of see my hand down here, is I'm just grabbing the stem right between here where the keepers go on that ridge with a paper towel. That way I can hold it in position and move the valve up and down, because I have the compound in here and I'm not just slamming the drill down into it and hogging the thing out. So I'm just barely moving this stem up and down a little bit to keep that compound working between the face of the valve and the top of the engine, so that way it keeps grinding away at everything, if that makes any sense to you guys. I can only, yeah. So there we go, just like that. So that's all I'm doing. Just moving it up and down ever so slightly. Let the compound work and then come up, and it pulls more in with a little puddle that it forms there. And then I switch directions and go the other way a little bit. So it's just a different way of lapping in valves. It's not as efficient, obviously. If I had a valve seat cutter and a proper tool for cutting the valve faces, someday I'll have one when I get a bigger shop. But right now we're working with what we got, and this does give me a respectfully decent seat on my valves when all is said and done. And here is the final result of the valve lap. As you can see, seats turned out pretty well. The exhaust one's a little bit pitted up, but it'll do for now. And then the exhaust valve itself, if I can get that sheen off of there, well, you can kind of see it. It's got some pits in it going around. I did my best to reface it. I have a small, sort of a hokey little valve face tool with a piece of hardened, well, I'll show you guys. It's this piece right here. Just a little small valve refacer, kind of cheesy, but it works for what I have to do. Like I said, someday I'll have an actual machine to do all this stuff. So I hit the exhaust valve with that, and it seemed to clean up a lot of the grit and the pitting, but I didn't get all of it out because it's so deep. And then the intake valve, that cleaned up pretty well too. There's a little tiny bit of pitting right there, but not enough to make any difference. And I did put this valve in, the exhaust valve, with some pressure to the exhaust port, and I did make a nice seal despite all the pitting and everything else. So now that those are all done and the top of this engine is cleaned up, we can reinstall the valves. Top of the engine is all ready for the reassembly of the head. As you can see, I have the original copper head gasket all cleaned up fairly well. Of course, it's already squished from being used after all these years, but like I said, I don't have one, so that'll do for now, and it should seal up okay. I also ran this through the glass bead blaster pretty quick, and I could have hit it a little bit better, but it's about 10 degrees outside right now, and that glass bead blaster is out in the middle of the metal shed in the driveway, so I figured for the sake of temperature that'll be good enough. But the mating surface is all cleaned up nicely. You can see the sheen on there, so that should mate up to the copper gasket fairly well. And then of course we have all the head bolts cleaned up and ready to go. Head's all torqued down. Everything went down to 20 foot-pounds, and it might not be perfect, but we do have compression, and it'll be enough to get this thing to run. We are leaking out the valves just a little bit. As you guys saw, they were pretty well pitted, but for what it didn't have before, I'm pretty happy with what it's got now. And I can hear a little bit of it coming out the breather too, and I know this engine is probably pretty tired with as old as it is, but that's got enough compression to get this thing to run. So the next thing we got to do is get this ignition system addressed and see if we can get some spark out of it. That's the inside of the flywheel. Let's see, it had some moisture and stuff sitting there for a little while. Get that cleaned up. Pretty interesting ignition system too. The points and everything are all exposed on here, as you can see. It's kind of cool, but it doesn't keep the moisture and stuff off of them, unfortunately. So we'll work on getting these cleaned up and see if we can get them, the point faces, cleaned up and get a little bit of spark out of it with any luck. Ignition system for the most part is all cleaned up. So the points had about 20 or 30 thou of just corrosion sitting on the contacts. It was pretty thick. I don't know if you guys can see it now, but they are nice and clean. I ran some 400 grit sandpaper through there for a while, smooth the faces off again, so we have a nice contact surface. So what I did is I went to put the flywheel back on because the edge of the flywheel has timing marks, and this is the timing mark on the backing plate, as you can see, TC, which is top center. And then the side of this flywheel right here, granted is upside down, but it has TC, and there is a center punch mark there, there, and there. So what I did is I pushed the flywheel on and I lined it up with that center punch mark, the top center line on the engine, and then I pulled the flywheel off the best I could without moving the crankshaft, and the points were just barely starting to touch. And I flipped over this flywheel and I noticed it looks like there's holes in the front of it, and when you saw me pull the pulley off, there's still this piece of plate on here. Well, it turns out you pull this off like so, and then with the flywheel on there you can adjust your points and everything. This is kind of what I like about the old equipment. It's pretty neat because they have your contact opening is 20 thousandths for your points. So here's the flywheel put on, and as you can see through the hole, I can see my points right there. So when I turn this flywheel on the top, to that mark, that is where, granted it's going to be kind of tough to see, but that's right where they start to open, and that will break the contact. And of course your magnets are already passing by your armature over here, and that is what's going to create your spark, because then it'll get up to top center there. And when I did have this head off, I looked at where that dot was, and it's probably about that far down before the top of the cylinder, before top dead center. So it fires just a little bit before, and these systems obviously didn't have a mechanical advance or anything like that, or a vacuum advance like an old truck or some of the tractors did. So they had to do them like that in order to get them to fire right. And of course at top center you can see that our points are completely open, and the next dot, which I haven't checked yet, which is just a little bit past, they are still, yep, they're still open. So it's got a pretty big flat spot on the lobe that's on this crankshaft where the points ride around. So what I'm going to do is get these adjusted to 20 thou, and then I'll run it around and see, make sure everything's opening where it should be according to the marks, and then we can see if it's got spark. Now that we have good spark out of our ignition system, it's time to move over to the fuel system. So I went ahead and pulled the carburetor off, and this is a Tillotson model YC1B carburetor. I believe the base model is YC, and these were used on a number of pieces of equipment back in the 30s and the 40s. You can still find kits for them and everything. So we're going to get this opened up and see how it looks inside. So this really doesn't look that bad inside, folks. As you can see, there's a bunch of white corrosion inside of there on the aluminum casting, just from moisture and stuff over the years getting into the carburetor, and that'll clean out nicely inside the glass bead blaster. And the top half here, as you guys can see, is also in fairly nice shape. Float looks to be in good condition. It's not caved in or anything like that. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is get all this stuff disassembled, pulled apart, ran through the glass bead blaster, and then cleaned up and ready for reassembly. Carburetor is all rebuilt and back together. As you can see, it cleaned up really nice in the glass bead blaster. And I also have it prepped and ready for clear coat as well. And this is what I do to all the customers' carburetors that come through here when I rebuild them. Everything gets ran through the glass bead blaster, regasketed, rebuilt, and then they get hit with 3 coats of clear. That way it preserves them and it cleans them up nice too, and seems to hold up pretty well. I'm also going to be doing the fuel shutoff, as I got the T-handle repacked with some new leather packing that I cut for it. And I'll be able to use this original brass shutoff, which is kind of neat. And then of course the copper line too, I straightened out the curl on that because whoever did it, I think it was replaced and it wasn't done very well, so I wrapped that around a piece of pipe, straightened that out some. And then as for the fuel tank, I did say it was clean inside, but there was a little bit of just surface rust, so I blasted that with the glass bead blaster and got what I could of it out, at least the crispy stuff that's going to fall off. But I did find a pinhole, as you can see right there at the tip of my fingernail. So I'm going to hit that with a little bit of braze and fill that up. And then the rest of this tank should be good because I don't see any light coming through it and everything seems to be solid. So we'll get that brazed up. Fuel tank's all brazed up. It took nicely to the metal, so that pinhole is all squared away. And then the carburetor and the fuel line are both drying from the clear coat. So the next thing I have to do is get this drive system freed up on here, and especially this clutch here. So this moves, as you can see, back and forth just a little bit, but there's clutch plates stacked inside of this cup right here, and those, if I'm not mistaken, it should be a clutch plate, like a fiber plate, and then a metal plate, fiber plate, metal plate, one of those style of clutches, because that's what I can see looking in here. I can see a little clutch finger sticking up into this casting area right there. So because this sat outside for so long, most likely moisture got in between all the plates and rusted everything up. So as much as I wanted to keep this assembly in the tractor, it looks like I can remove it easily enough if I pull these chains, and then there's 2 bolts on either side on these castings, and this whole entire assembly can come off of here. So that's what we're going to do. Let's get this pulled out, and then we can open up this clutch. So this clutch assembly is just held in by 2 1/2-inch fine thread bolts on either side, and they just go through a couple of castings that way into the frame. And once you get those out, clutch assembly is out. It's actually pretty easy to remove, which is nice. So if you ever had to service it or anything like that, 4 bolts and a couple of chains and the whole thing is out on the bench. So what I'm going to do is put one end of this, or a couple ends of it, in the parts washer and just see if I can scrub off some of this built up grease and everything and figure out how this goes together, because I know there's nuts on the end of this cross shaft here, so I don't know if everything tightens down and stacks together like this, or if it has set screws and keyways in here, or what the deal is. So I'm going to get it cleaned up, and then I can take a look at it and see how this thing comes apart. And this will be set initially once it's in the tractor. Carburetor and fuel line are both ready to go on. Fire it up and let it run for a little bit.